Welcome back, story lovers. Please consider liking and subscribing. Chapter 10. A week had rushed by since the demon from her childhood nightmares had attacked Marnie and Tem, and fearing an unknown infection, she'd placed a sample of her blood under the electron microscope. This wasn't the first time she'd thoroughly investigated her body fluids. Before her eyes was an unknown organism with a genome she couldn't identify. She made a note to mention her findings to a colleague and moved on with her other research. The first sign that something within her had transformed was a peculiar sensation she'd never experienced before. It was like a fracturing of the skull, then a crumbling, until finally her imprisoned brain was released, and light and clarity flooded in without limit. She possessed a new kind of thinking which sprang from the recesses of her mind. Deep and meaningful philosophies roused and rose like spirits through the layers of everyday detritus, and a kaleidoscope of ideas continually turned. In some ways, it was an internal terror attack, as the thought explosions were hard to control and contain. It all flowed so fast that it was hard to fix on anything. Rapidly, she relearned how to focus and follow through with one element at a time. Eventually, things stopped spinning. Her mind was crystal clear, and she had all the answers. It was this new way of being which pushed her into action. In this strange state, Marnie had called around to see Conran, desperate to rest her mind on something normal. He'd invited her in for coffee and greeted her with his usual cool and kind persona, chatting with a nonchalant attitude about his illness, saying how much better he felt. However, as he talked, beads of sweat sprouted on his forehead, and he coughed and wheezed. When he suppressed a sneeze by pressing his nostrils together, the hair rose on the back of Marnie's neck. Later, he blew his nose and discarded the tissue in a wastepaper bin. When his back was turned to refill her mug, she grabbed the offending object and placed it in a bag she'd concealed in her pocket. Following the visit, Marnie, driven by a potent mixture of rage and grief, decided to take a detour from her normal routine and, without consulting any of her colleagues, late one evening entered the new biotechnology lab, which was rapidly built in South River during the earlier outbreaks. The facility was also capable of manufacturing large quantities of vaccines and therapeutic serums. Of course, her presence would show on the cameras, and she would explain her actions away at the right time, but tonight she didn't want to be disturbed. It was important to be alone and direct her rage against her miniature but clever enemy, especially as now she was one step ahead. This was personal, as something unknown was attacking Conran. "This shouldn't take long," she said to Shadow, whom she'd glimpsed out of the corner of her eye. She was glad to have his companionship on her lonely journey. In the side room, she put on the hazmat suit. Almost immediately, beads of sweat bloomed on her forehead, and her cheeks burned. A mist crossed her eyes. "This is no good, and probably overkill for a cold virus," she uttered to Shadow. She took the cumbersome suit and helmet off and opted for the less intrusive surgical masks and gloves. "I need to see him move." Previously, she'd worked with malaria, Zika, MERS, and the SARS viruses, creating emerging antibody therapies. Initially, these methods were used as an emergency rescue option to benefit those who were seriously ill. Surprisingly, the method worked well. The viral loads of her study patients dropped, and in many cases, the critically ill patients pulled through. Marnie took a swab from her wound, noticing how remarkably quickly it had healed. Now, under the microscope, she was able to detect the antibodies she'd developed after her previous contagions, and was pleased to see they were numerous. "Perhaps I'm like Tem, one of those people who gets infected but doesn't get sick," Marnie considered. "I might also have different DNA." Marnie was relieved that if both she and Conran were clear, they could continue to head into the future without fear. With a racing pulse, she fixed her eyes on the screen and manoeuvred the slide to search Conran's mucus for any harmful viruses and abandoned herself to the tiny world. She marvelled at the mass of swirling life, a miniature cosmos battling for control. Almost immediately, she saw she was viewing a novel coronavirus. God is angry and reasserting its divine prerogative to cause conflict and take control, she thought, with building dread. Marnie straightened, flicked her lashes, and refocused. The corona on the virus was different from anything she'd seen before. There was the same symmetry that appeared in nature, but the spikes had no defined features on the end, only a point. Despite this, they were still entering and destroying cells at an alarming rate. The skeleton key spikes had adapted to fit the locks on any cell. It mutated in response to anything it came across, entering with ease and destroying. The load of the virus was a new horror, as it replicated at an alarming speed. Disappointed and dumbfounded, she watched the savage dance. Marnie was on high alert, her brain galloping down multiple paths at the same time. It wasn't looking good for Conran, but there was no way of knowing how the alien beings would react. All she understood was her overwhelming desire to purge all lethal parasites from the Planet A red fountain of anger spurted into her brain. I must calm down. It may still be harmless or short-lived. Marnie surveyed her neon kingdom and then strolled into the dressing room and took a drink of water from the machine. She sensed Shadow at her side. What am I going to do? He will need to be isolated to see what course his illness takes. How will I explain all this to my boss? She paced and chatted onto Shadow without glancing in his direction. Words entered her mind that she knew to be his, and not hers. You're asymptomatic and haven't suffered any ill effects from any of the outbreaks. Perhaps there is something in your blood. Shadow, I've tried that many times, and so have others. It does work in some cases, but in others, only for a short time. The immunity doesn't last long enough against the ever-changing mutations. Marnie glanced at her watch and saw it was midnight. It won't hurt to snatch another hour to investigate further, she said to Shadow. In the whirlpool moment, she decided to re-examine other viruses as a comparison and review how they reacted with her plasma. By 4 a.m, after repeating her experiments, she realised something in her plasma was destroying the keys of the coronavirus, blocking their entry into normal cells. It was an unimaginable outcome and something she'd never seen in all the times she'd worked in antibody research. Lastly, it was time to try Conran's novel virus. Full of excitement and hope, she waited and watched. My goodness, Shadow, we've discovered a miracle. Her joy was amplified, and when she turned to share the moment with her friend, she saw that he'd vanished. Out of all the samples, the evidence on Conran's virus was inconclusive. She was unsure if the unidentifiable substance in her blood was making any difference. It needs longer, that's all, and requires further investigation, she considered. She'd inadvertently discovered a cure for all the major viruses, but the uncertainty over the one which mattered played on her mind. Energised and engrossed, Marnie hadn't noticed dawn breaking. She sensed a presence and, glancing around, saw her boss, Professor Troy Edwards, standing in the clean room. He gestured to her to come out. The balding man, a fatherly type, smiled sympathetically. Marnie, you worry me, he said. The doorman says you've been here all night, and he saw you prattling to yourself. You work too hard. Marnie restlessly shifted on her feet, wondering how she could explain her discovery to the kindly man. Despite her concerns, she understood the significance of her findings and the importance of explaining them. Do you have some time? It's important, she smiled warmly. Having always enjoyed Troy's company, he was a highly intelligent man with gentle humour. Go ahead. What's up? I've done something unethical and discovered something beyond our imaginings, Marnie said, trying to rein in her fast-thinking mind and tongue. There was no time for small talk. Marnie, I must warn you that anything unethical has to be investigated. I know. Could you please listen, she said, no longer caring if she lost her job. I will give you the short version. Yes, I would appreciate that, as I haven't had my 2 cups of coffee yet, he smiled amiably. I took some antibody-rich serum and tested it against many of our major killers, and it destroyed them all. I can prove it to you. Whose blood did you use? He said with a stern expression. Mine. Troy laughed as though he'd heard the funniest joke. Do you know how many times I've heard that story from colleagues? So your blood has some miracle ingredient. You know what happens in the lab is rarely transferable to real life. Yes, I know I'm a greenhorn, but please check my findings. I will. If you promise me, you'll go home and rest. This could be the fulfillment of my dream, she said, yawning. And a good source of funding if you're correct, he added. But I'm afraid a cure-all is highly unlikely against such formidable enemies. Besides, I've never known of anyone doing a thorough study in one night. I will need much convincing. I know it all sounds unbelievable, but it was as if I already had the answers, and they were just waiting to be called upon. You've always been an odd one, Marnie, but I've never seen you this excited before. I will take a look. My notes are all there, and everything is waiting for your perusal. Marnie decided not to inform Edwards about the emergence of the new virus. My blood worked against the new virus in the lab, but in a real-life situation, it might have little effect, she thought. If I transfused my blood plasma into Conran, we could have a cure, and there's Thames to test, she considered as she removed her scrubs. Of course, Edwards will discover the enemy lurking in my notes, but by then I will have Conran safely hidden in the facility's private hospital. Thank you for listening to Chapter 9. You may find all my books in your favourite online stores and in Audible. To be continued.